Hello everybody, thanks for joining. For those of you that I've not met before, my name is Joanne Wright and I work with Louise Kirby in the Support and Information team at the Bone Cancer Research Trust. Just to say, we're going to be recording today's webinar so that we can upload it to our YouTube channel. So if you don't want your image to be shown, please turn off your cameras. Also, you're on mute at the moment. If you can stay muted whilst Monica's talking, just because it cuts down on background noise. There will be an opportunity to ask Monica questions at the end. If you'd like to do that, if you just pop a message in the chat box and I'll look at them, and then at the end I'll invite you to put your question personally to Monica. So I'll just hand you over now to Louise, who'll do the introduction.
Thanks, Jo. So we're very pleased today to be joined by Monika Szefnicka for our 7th Support and Information webinar, which seems crazy. We've done quite a few now. So Monika is a specialist dietitian with extensive experience working with oncology patients, both teenagers and adults. And the aim of Monika's webinar today is to talk us through the importance of nutrition and managing diet during and also after cancer treatment. Monika also works very closely with the British Dietetics Association, so she's always ensuring that her nutritional advice is founded in solid evidence, which is very, very important. So we'll hand over to you, Monika, and yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone, nice to meet you all. So I'm going to be going through nutrition during and after cancer. So I'm just going to share my screen because I've got a presentation here which I'd like to talk you through. I'm going to be going through quite a few topics. So as Jo and Louise said, as we come to the end, then there'll be plenty of opportunity for questions. So please just jot them down and feel free to ask any question. I think sometimes people aren't sure, but quite often everyone's thinking the same thing. So please don't be afraid to put any questions forward. So just to let you know what I'm going to be talking about, one of the first things is just talking about what a balanced diet actually is. I feel like that term is bandied around so much, but actually people aren't sure what exactly we're talking about. Then I wanted to touch on things like sugar, dairy, whether you need to follow a vegetarian diet, all in sort of the context of having a cancer diagnosis. And then talking about side effects during treatment, something called nutrition impact symptoms, which are things like a sore mouth or loss of taste, which can be really difficult if you're going through treatment, and it can be difficult to eat. And then something called late effects, which is when you finish treatment and you think you're all done, and then a while later you actually start to develop some symptoms. So what to do about that. And then I just wanted to touch on dietary fiber and the gut microbiota, and how that might play a role. I know that it's sort of very popular at the moment and it's in a lot of the media, so I just wanted to discuss that as well. Okay, so first I just wanted to show you this. This is the Eat Well Guide, which you may or may not have seen. It's something that we use for 5-year-olds and up, so adults as well, just thinking about getting that balance. So essentially you've got all the different food groups there and you need them in different amounts. So we're going to just go through those food groups. So things like starchy carbohydrates, those are things like your potatoes, bread, rice, pasta, yam, naan, all of those. And they're really important, even though they get a bit of a bad press for being fattening, which they're not at all. If you can, try and go for the whole grain and brown varieties, because that means they've got lots of fiber in them, which is really important. And a lot of us don't actually get enough fiber as it is. Essentially something like white bread or white rice has had that fiber taken away, which is a real shame. I think the reason people think these might be fattening, and you often hear people say, well, I've cut out carbohydrates, so I've lost loads of weight, is usually down to the portion size. So if you're sitting down to a curry and your whole plate is rice, and then you put your curry on top, and then to the side you have your naan bread and chapati, then yes, if you cut out that carbohydrate, you're suddenly cutting out a lot of calories and you will lose weight. But it's not usually the way forward. What you want to do is just maybe cut down your portion size, and we'll talk about that in a bit as well, rather than cutting them out completely. And then just be careful with what you're adding. So often with pasta, it's nice to add loads of cheese, or on your toast, it's nice to have it dripping with butter. So it's just thinking about what you're adding to your carbs as well that might be boosting those calories. So next up with fruit and vegetables, probably no surprise to everyone that this is obviously a really important group. We often talk about getting your 5 a day. We don't always make it clear though what that actually means. So a portion, so one of your 5 is essentially a handful. So that's kind of the easiest way to remember it. So like an apple, a banana, a handful of peas, something like that. And it's we talk about eating the rainbow, and the reason we say that is you want to get loads of different fruit and veg in there, so all the different colors actually signify the different vitamins and minerals that fruit and veg contain, and they have lots of antioxidants as well, so you want to be getting lots of fruit and veg all different types. So just eating 5 apples a day doesn't quite cut it, unfortunately. And I put a little snack fact in the corner there, and it's just to remind people that you don't have to eat fresh fruit and veg only. Things like tinned fruit and veg, frozen as well, all count, which is really useful. So if possible, if you're going for tinned, you don't want it to be in brine because that means it's in salt. And in syrup obviously means that it's in sugar. So other than that though, you're pretty good to go. If you've got frozen veg in the freezer, it means you've always got something to add to your main meals, which can be really helpful. And they're just as nutritious. So no reason to worry about that. And then a lot of people also ask me about juicing or having smoothies, or can I just do that? Is that enough to get my 5 a day? What we say to that is it's fine to have a glass, about 150 mils of either a fruit juice or a smoothie, and that does count as a portion, but no more than that, because when you do blitz things down in a blender, you break down some of the nutrients and a lot of the fiber as well. So it's not quite as good as eating the whole fruit. So certainly fine to have a glass a day, but again, don't just rely on that to get your 5 portions a day. And also to say that it's at least 5 a day. So that's kind of the minimum that we're aiming for, but any more than that is a bonus as well. So then going on to your protein-rich foods, and these are things like your pulses, and by that I mean things like chickpeas, lentils, kidney beans, baked beans. So they're all brilliant for protein and fiber as well, which is a bonus. Fish, eggs, meat, soya. So you can see in this protein group, it's not just meat and animal products. You can actually get it from a lot of plant sources as well. So that's really helpful for people who are potentially vegetarian or vegan, because getting your protein is really important. It's kind of what keeps you strong. It helps you build your muscles. If you've had surgery, then having enough protein is going to make sure that you're recovering well after surgery as well. So then we have our dairy and alternatives. I am going to be talking a bit more about dairy in the slides coming up, but essentially we're talking about milk, yogurts and cheese. But if you don't want to have dairy, then you've got the alternatives, so things like soya, almond milk and that kind of stuff. Just if you do go for those, always check the packet of the milk, the carton, that it's been calcium fortified, because we get a lot of our calcium from dairy. So if we choose not to have that, then we need to make sure that we're getting it from somewhere else, because keeping our bones strong is really important, particularly as we get older, because we can be more prone to fractures and osteoporosis if we're not getting enough calcium. And then oils and spreads. So we're talking things like olive oil, vegetable oil when you're cooking, spreads. There are lots of different types of spreads out there, and butter as well. They're really important fats. We need to have them in our diet. It's not something that we want to cut out completely. We just don't need them in huge quantities. So if you are cooking, then opt for an unsaturated fat. And by that, I mean like a vegetable oil or olive oil. Rapeseed oil is great as well, but you just don't want to go overboard, because they're high in calories and our bodies don't actually need loads of them. Okay, so just wanted to quickly talk about the sweet treats, because they're not in a group per se by themselves on the Eat Well guide. And I didn't want you to think that you can't have them. That's certainly not the case at all. The things with foods that are high in fat, salt and sugar, they don't really provide any essential nutrients. So we don't have to have them in our diet, although I think lots of people would disagree with that. But just talking more from a nutritional point of view, they're not essential like some of the other nutrients are. but of course, you know, they're tasty. And so having your afternoon tea with some biscuits or your hot chocolate or whatever it is that you want is certainly not a bad thing. As long as you're following a balanced diet most of the time, then it's fine to, you know, have your cake. And certainly don't feel guilty about it. You know, you don't want to be feeling guilty about what you're eating. The main thing is actually just to enjoy it. Which that actually brings us onto sugar quite nicely. So sugar and cancer has been a really hot topic recently. So I just wanted to go through it and just give you a bit of background first, and then talk about why it's been sort of a topic of interest. So what is sugar? It's essentially a very tiny unit of carbohydrate. So you have the more complex carbohydrates, so things like your potatoes and your whole grains, and they're long chains of these units, and sugar is just a small unit essentially. And when you eat carbohydrate, everything's broken down to these tiny units so that we can absorb them. They're naturally present in a lot of food, and food that's actually really good for us. So things like fruit, vegetables, and milk, we would never say stop eating those because they have a little bit of sugar in them. There's certainly nothing wrong with that. So when we're talking about the sugars that we're trying to avoid, really what we're talking about are the free sugars. And what we mean by that are sugars that are added to food and drink during cooking, and also to things like biscuits and cakes, soft drinks and things like that. But we're also talking about those that are naturally present in things like honey and syrups. So people don't realize that things like date syrup, agave syrup, all of those, which are really popular as well in sort of the healthier recipes, that's still sugar. So if you see something that says it's sugar-free, and then in the ingredients, you've got one of those listed, it's not sugar-free. Your body recognizes it as a sugar and utilizes it in exactly the same way. That's not to say that it's bad for you, it's just, it is a sugar. And then you've got the unsweetened fruit juices as well. The reason we talk about sugars in fruit juice is, if you can imagine you're eating an orange, and normally if you sit down to eat a whole orange, you usually eat one, maybe two. But if you make a glass of orange juice, quite often a lot of oranges are going to go into that glass. So yes, oranges will have a little bit of sugar in each one, but suddenly when you condense a lot of oranges into one glass of fruit juice, they become really high in sugar. And also because you've broken them down, you've taken away that fiber, it's really easy for our bodies to absorb that sugar. So that's why we say try to only have one glass of fruit juice or smoothie a day, for that reason, even if it's not had sugar added to it. And the reason for that is because they absorb really quickly, and so we get those spikes in our sugar levels, and it's easy to have a lot more calories than we need from sugar. And then I've just put there that adults really shouldn't have more than 7 sugar cubes a day, and that's equivalent really to 7 teaspoons, just to give you an idea of how much to have. So that's essentially what sugar is. But does it feed cancer? So this has been, you know, something that people have been talking about, and there's quite a lot on social media, on the internet about this. So I just wanted to go into a little bit of the science, so bear with me. Essentially, we have obviously all the cells in our body. Some are healthy and some are the ones that are the cancer cells. All of them will use sugar, sometimes called glucose, for energy. So that's just how a cell will work. So what happens is it takes the sugar in and then it produces lots of energy. Essentially, the difference is that healthy cells are really good at making this energy. They can take a little bit of sugar in from our blood and then make loads of energy to then go about whatever they need to do. The thing with cancer cells is they're not quite as good, so they have an altered metabolism. So they take in the same amount of sugar as a healthy cell, but they're just not as good as producing as much energy. So they're not as efficient. So what that means is they're taking in more and more and more sugar to try and make a bit more energy. So they're just not as good as it, essentially. And that's how a PET scan works. For any of you who've had that, what they do is they're injecting that glucose into your blood. And because your cancer cells are so metabolically active, they light up because they're trying to take in as much sugar as they can to produce some energy. So it's not that you're eating sugar and then it's going straight to the cancer cells and they're using that to feed and to grow. That's not quite how it works. It's more just about the metabolism. And the other thing to remember is our bodies are so clever because we need glucose to survive. So our brains wouldn't survive without having that glucose. So our bodies are really good at, if we stop eating sugar, they just start breaking down other things to make sugar. So they can break down the protein in our muscles to make sugar. They can start breaking down our fat stores to make sugar. So pretty much there's always going to be glucose circulating in your blood. So that's another thing to think about if you are thinking about cutting down. That's not to say that, I mean, a lot of us probably are having a bit too much sugar in our diet. So usually it doesn't hurt to think about whether you are having too much in the forms of biscuits and cake and that kind of thing. But I think a lot of people sometimes when they have a cancer diagnosis feel that they have to cut out sugar entirely. And so this is just to say that you certainly don't need to do that. Okay. So moving on to dairy, I know I sort of touched on this when we were talking about the food groups, but essentially, so it's milk, cheese, and yogurt. We've got cows, which is pretty much usually what we have in this country, but sheep and goats, milk, cheese, and yogurt as well. So just thinking about what the research shows, because I think a lot of people talk about dairy and how bad it is and that it causes cancer. And I think there's been a lot of fear mongering around that in recent years as well. But actually, when you look at the evidence, the only thing that it shows is that actually dairy products are very good at reducing the risk of colorectal cancer. And there's nothing to suggest that, you know, having dairy in your diet is going to be a cause of cancer, or if you have cancer, you should be avoiding it. I think two of the things that people are worried about are growth factors and hormones. So the first thing to say is that in the UK, we're not actually allowed to use growth enhancing hormones. So that's often what's given to cows in some countries to make them to produce more milk, but we don't use those. So that's not something that we need to worry about. Even if there was something in the milk, probably our body would just recognize it as a protein and break it down and digest it and get rid of it in the way we do with other proteins. And the other thing I think people are worried about are antibiotics. So if a cow is given an antibiotic, which it might do if it's got an infection, then it's taken out of the food chain. It's given the antibiotics and it's not allowed back into the food chain until it's completely clear those antibiotics. So I know there's very rigorous testing in this country to make sure that, you know, our dairy products are completely clear of that. So just to sort of reassure people that it is safe to have. That's not to say that for some people, they just can't tolerate dairy. It might give them tummy problems. Some people have lactose intolerance. Lactose is a sugar naturally found in milk. And they might not be able to break that down properly. So it might give them some bloating and some gas. And if that's the case, then of course, you know, going for alternatives is totally fine. Some people don't like the taste. So again, going for the alternatives is not a problem at all. Just thinking about how much you have. So 2 to 3 portions of dairy is generally fine for most people, but some people do need more. So let's say you've been on high dose steroids, if someone's pregnant or breastfeeding, if you've got osteoporosis, then you might need more than that. Usually your doctors can advise you on how much you need, or you might need to take a calcium supplement to make sure you're getting enough. So just to give you an idea of what a portion is, so essentially it's a glass of milk, or a small pot of yogurt, or a matchbox size of cheese. When I talk about a matchbox, I mean the little ones, not the ginormous ones, unfortunately. And then also something like sardines with the edible bones. So you have to eat the bones as well if you like that. If that's your thing, then they've got lots of calcium in as well. So there is calcium in other foods that I've put in the box there in the corner. So calcium fortified bread, pulses, broccoli as well. Just remember that they haven't got quite as much calcium as dairy. So you just need to think about that. If you're having, they're still good to have in your diet. And like I said earlier, if you're having the alternatives like the soy or the almond milk, again, just check that it's been fortified with calcium, because that's where you'll be getting a lot of the calcium from. Okay. So just thinking about vegan, again, it's really popular at the moment, and I think people do it for different reasons. In the past, more people were doing it for ethical reasons, which is obviously completely understandable. But recently, because it's caught on, I think people are doing it sometimes maybe because it's a diet trend, and people do love a trend, and also because they think it's healthier. So I just wanted to talk through those and whether it is actually healthier to be vegan or vegetarian. I did just want to talk about what the differences are, because there are a few different terms. So vegetarian, generally, if you're vegetarian, you eat dairy foods and eggs, but not meat and poultry. And some people also eat fish and seafood, so they might call themselves pescatarians. So whenever I'm asking someone about what they eat, I always just clarify, because people kind of have their own take on what they will and won't eat. So vegan, you avoid all animal products, so things like meat, fish, seafood, dairy, eggs, and honey. And flexitarian, so this is quite popular as well, is where you might generally be a vegetarian, but let's say at weekends you decide to eat meat and poultry, so you refer to yourself as a flexitarian. So I know quite a few people are doing that just to try and bring down how much meat and poultry they have in their diets. So that's the difference. In terms of what kind of diet we should all be following, we should all be trying to eat more vegetables, more whole grains, more fruit, and eating a bit less meat in our diets, and just making sure you're getting enough protein. And that can be from an animal source or a plant source. And that is completely down to you. It is possible to have a healthy diet if you're vegan. It might take a bit more consideration, and I'll talk about that on the next slide, just with regards to some nutrients. But you can also have a very healthy diet with animal products in it. You just need to think about how much you're having and making sure you're getting that balance right. The thing to say about red meat is the World Cancer Research Fund suggests that you can have up to 3 portions a week. So that's about 350 to 500 grams of red meat, which is actually quite, a fair amount when you think about having all your different protein sources in there as well during the week. And the thing with processed meat, so that's things like ham and bacon, sadly, is that you want to try and cut that down as much as possible. And the World Cancer Research Fund actually says try and not have it if possible, just because it has been shown to increase your risk of colon cancer. Again, I would say that's not to say you can't have it as a treat every now and again. It's just to think about if you're having a bacon sandwich for breakfast every morning and a ham sandwich for every lunch, then you might want to think about switching it up and thinking about how you can get more vegetables and whole grains in there. And this might be just a good time, I said we could talk about portion sizes. So when you're thinking about your plate and you're looking down at it, even if you are eating meat and you've got that on your plate, you still want your plate to mainly be lots of whole grains. So by that, I mean things like brown rice, pasta, some potatoes, lots of vegetables, salad. So that should be making up the majority of your plate, and then having your protein source. So if that is meat, a good way to remember it is it's a fillet of chicken, or a piece of red meat would be like the size of the palm of your hand. So again, even if you are a meat eater, loads of having lots of whole grains on that plate is really important. And another way to remember it is sort of a third of the plate each. So a third is your carbohydrate, a third is your vegetables or salad, and then a third is your protein source as well. That's kind of a way of starting to think about getting that balance right. Okay, so I just mentioned that vegetarian and vegan diets, because if you do decide to cut out some certain foods like meat, then you just need to think about what nutrients you're cutting out as well. So with something like red meat, it's really rich in iron. So if you're going to stop eating that, you just need to think about where you're going to get your iron from. So here I've just listed some of the nutrients you need to think about. It's quite a lot of information here. So if you are someone who's thinking about becoming vegetarian or vegan, or you already are, then the Vegan Society is a really good place to go to, and it actually talks about all of these things in more depth. So just thinking about protein, where you're going to get them from, pulses are brilliant. So again, thinking about those are your beans and lentils, but nuts, seeds, soy products. If you eat them, eggs, they're all brilliant for protein if you're trying to cut down on your meat. Iron, so that's in your green leafy vegetables, your dried fruits, nuts, pulses, and whole grains. Calcium as well, so I was talking about the dairy alternatives, but also again, green leafy vegetables, tofu, dried fruit are good for calcium. Omega-3 fats, so they're really important. You've probably heard about them in terms of being cardioprotective, so good for your heart, but also for your brain. So things like walnuts, linseeds, and hemp seeds, chia seeds, because often we find omega-3 fats in oily fish. So if you are eating oily fish, or you do eat fish, it's good to have, you know, a portion or two a week to get your omega-3s. But otherwise, if you don't, this is where you can get them from. Vitamin D, so the main source is the sun. Unfortunately, in this country, that can be a bit tricky, particularly during the winter months. So actually, the government suggests that we take a supplement during autumn and winter, so especially essentially October to March. Iodine, again, something people don't think about when they become vegan, is we usually get a lot of iodine from our dairy products. So if you're cutting that out, usually a supplement is the easiest way to get it. And same with vitamin B12, generally you only get from meat products and animal products. So again, some foods are fortified, but usually you do need to take a supplement. So essentially, if you are going vegan, it's not a case of just cutting out some foods. You do need to think about the nutrients you're cutting out and how you're going to replace those, because you don't want to end up deficient in any nutrients, you know, because you've gone vegan. Okay. So now I'm just going to move on to nutrition impact symptoms. So I'm just going to have a quick sip of water. These are it's basically the term for some people who during treatment develop side effects. So that can be because of your chemotherapy, or it can be because of your radiotherapy as well. And it can be really difficult because not only are you on treatment, you're feeling really tired, but if you've got these symptoms as well that are making it difficult for you to eat, then you might find that you're losing weight, or you just lose that enjoyment of eating, which can be difficult not only for you, but also for if you've got loved ones around you as well who are trying to do everything they can to get you to eat. So I just wanted to go through some of them. Again, if you've got any questions about these at the end, then I can definitely answer those in more detail. So a really common one are taste changes, particularly on chemotherapy, because the chemotherapy unfortunately will affect the cells lining your mouth as well. So that's where a lot of your taste buds are. So you might find that you completely lose your taste, or things taste just really odd and you don't want to have them anymore. So a few ideas when you're cooking, try and add herbs and spices to bring out the different flavors, or just to give the food a flavor that you perhaps prefer so it doesn't taste really weird. Also choosing sharper tasting food. So if you've lost your taste, something like a chutney or pineapple chunks or anything like that, you know, pickled onions can really cut through, and you'll find that you can actually taste those. Same with, you know, adding spices to a curry or something, which you may perhaps not have liked before, but again, because it's such a strong flavor, it's something that you can taste. The only thing I'd say is if you have a sore mouth, then you don't want to be having those things, because it can actually make it worse and it can irritate it. So just, you know, you need to be able to decide what's going to work for you. And this is another one that people don't sometimes think about, is actually checking for oral thrush, because quite often when you're having treatment, you're on a lot of different medications. You might have had antibiotics, or steroids, and you can get sort of thrush on your tongue, and that's where a lot of your taste buds are. So if that's coated, that means that you're not going to be able to taste the food. And so you can have a look in the mirror to see that, or you can ask a doctor or nurse to have a look, and it's actually really easy to treat. So that might be an easy way of just solving that problem. But making sure that you've got good health hygiene as well. So brushing your teeth at least a couple of times a day. Some people might find that a bit sore if they have a sore mouth, so just using a softer toothbrush and doing it gently should make it a bit easier. So thinking about a sore mouth, again, this is something that people develop, and if someone's been on something perhaps like methotrexate, then you can get something called mucositis, where you've sort of got an ulcerated mouth, and that might actually travel down your gut, so it can be anywhere along the lining of your gut, which can make it really difficult to eat. So firstly, try and hold off on acidic foods. I think people do that naturally anyway, because it can really sting. And I think people sort of tend to go for moist, softer food. So again, you want something nice and soft that isn't going to be difficult to chew. If you think about something like crisps or toast, they're a bit rough, and so you want to avoid those kind of things. And then again, things like that are cold, like yogurt or ice cream, might slip down nice and easily. I do find sometimes when I see patients that they're using mouthwashes because they think that will help. Some are fine, and there are specific ones if you have a sore mouth, so it's definitely worth speaking to your team about that. But some have alcohol in them, and that can really sting, so certainly don't use those. So one of those is Corsadil, which I know is quite often used in hospitals, so just be careful with that. And then again, with something like loss of appetite, this is sort of affects people differently, but it is quite normal when you're on treatment to lose your appetite for many different reasons. And it may be that you're normally eating, or used to eat 3 meals a day, and that's what you're used to, and that's what worked well for you. But you might just need to switch things up a bit, eating little and often, there's nothing wrong with that. Sort of grazing through it during the day, having snacks. So you might find then things like beans on toast or cheese on toast is easier than having a full meal. Snacking on things like nuts or yogurt, making yourself smoothies in this case, that might help because it's easier to drink. And go for foods that you prefer. I know at the beginning of this talk I talked about what a balanced diet is, and yes, that's what we should be aiming for when we're feeling well, when we're in recovery, if we're not having any of these nutrition impact symptoms. But to be honest, if you're struggling to eat, then anything is good. And go for what you feel like having, and don't think, oh gosh, this is not the kind of thing I should be having. You just want to make sure that you're getting those calories and some protein in. And go for the higher calorie protein options as well. So if you're struggling to eat, then you could switch to a full fat milk for the short term. Again, same with yogurts. There's nothing wrong with that, because obviously you're trying to get those extra calories in. And then if you are really struggling actually with any of these and it's impacting on your intake, then you can ask your team to be referred to a dietitian, because they can then look at what you're eating and maybe make even more suggestions that are individual to you, or they can think about supplements. So we have special supplement drinks, you might have seen them around, that have extra vitamins and minerals added to them. So that's something you could try as well. Nausea, this is a really difficult one. If you're feeling sick, then you're not going to really want to feel like eating, but trying maybe to avoid strong smelling food. So perhaps if you're living with someone and they can do the cooking, or if not, having your kitchen well ventilated with the windows open. Bland food might be a bit easier rather than ones that have a really strong flavor. And also ask your team about anti-sickness tablets. And there are lots of different types. So if you've tried 1 or 2 and they haven't worked, don't give up. It's worth trying lots of different ones to see what works for you. And then just making sure that you're taking them usually, just before eating, maybe half an hour before eating, so that they can get to work, and then you can have your meal. And a lot of people find sipping things like ginger tea and mint tea are really helpful as well. They're quite refreshing and they just help with that nausea. And then you might find that you have a change in bowel habit, which again can make things really difficult. So depending on, whether you have perhaps diarrhea or constipation, changing the amount of fiber in your diet can help. You'd want to do that with a dietitian though, just to make sure you're doing, going about it the right way, and making sure that you're drinking enough fluid. So that's really important. Generally, we should be drinking about 8 glasses of fluid a day. It depends, if it's really hot, if you're doing a lot of exercise, then you obviously need to take on a bit more. the best way to tell is actually the color of your pee. So it should be sort of like a light straw color, essentially. If it's really dark, then that means you probably need to take on, drink a little bit more. And lots of fluids count. So quite often patients will say to me, I'm trying to drink 2 liters of water a day, but I'm finding it really difficult and I don't even like water. That's okay. It doesn't have to just be water. Things like you could add sugar-free squash to it to flavor it, tea, coffee, milk, those all count. So it doesn't have to just be water. So all those different fluids add up, which is really good. And what people don't realize sometimes is when you're constipated, it's actually because you're not drinking, you've not got enough fluid. So making sure you're drinking enough is one of the first questions I often ask people. And medications. So medications can firstly cause constipation or diarrhea, but also we've got ones that can help. So if you are constipated, then a laxative might help, or again an antidiarrheal could be helpful, but again it's just worth speaking to your medical team to see if there's anything that they can suggest. So that's whilst you're on treatment, but then just thinking about the longer term side effects of treatment. And this doesn't happen with everyone. Usually when you're on treatment and once it's finished, then things do start to get back to normal. It can take a bit of time. So those taste changes might hang around for a while, but you'll see bit by bit that as your taste buds get back to normal, things do start tasting as they should. And it's always worth going back to a food that you've not tried for a while to see how it tastes, just to see if things have gone back to normal. Some people though do develop side effects following treatment. So that can be months or even years after you've completed treatment. And we usually call those late effects. There are different things that you might experience, but symptoms might include things like diarrhea or constipation or bloating. So as you can imagine, that can be, difficult for people to have to put up with, particularly once you finish treatment. I'm sure it's not something that most people expect to happen. The first thing I say is just make sure you let your medical team know if these new symptoms do develop, purely because it's always just worth getting these things checked out. They might want to send you just for a few further investigations, so they can figure out what's going on, and then they can decide whether to send you on to a specialist like a gastroenterologist. So they're the ones who just check out what's going on with your tummy or bowel, or perhaps a dietitian if they think that you need to make some dietary changes. So just, make sure that you always highlight it to them. And then just thinking about the changes you can make. It kind of depends on the symptoms you're having and what's causing them. So some people have bile salt malabsorption, so that can give them diarrhea. Some people might find that they've got a lot more wind and they've developed, lactose intolerance, which is, when you're not so good with dairy foods. So first we need to find out what's causing the problem, and then we can think about how we're going to treat it. So I mentioned earlier about changing the amount of fiber in your diet. Usually when you haven't got any bowel symptoms, it's great to have a lot of fiber in your diet because it essentially keeps, you going regularly. But if you find that you've got a lot of diarrhea, then it might be a case of just holding back on that fiber. And I am going to talk about fiber in a bit more detail on the next slide, so I can sort of talk about what fiber is and where you might find it. Or again, if you're constipated, then you'd want to try and increase the fiber in your diet. Eating a regular meal pattern. I know that sounds quite simple, but quite often if someone's been on treatment, then they might have got out of that routine of eating regular meals, particularly if you'd lost your appetite, if you had taste changes, if you were particularly fatigued. Suddenly going back onto having a regular breakfast, lunch, dinner might take a bit of time, but that can really help with some of those symptoms. And again, just making sure you're drinking enough fluids. So those are just a few things. It's because it's such an individualized approach. I haven't gone into it into too much detail because I obviously just wanted to give you a general overview, but really just to stress that if you are having the symptoms, make sure you let your team know. ask for a dietitian if you want more advice on diet, because they'll then be able to look at what's going on and give you more of an individualized plan. So I said that I wanted to talk about fiber, so I'm just going to go into that in a bit more detail because I know I've mentioned it quite a bit. So essentially, again, it's a type of carbohydrate, but essentially it's the part of plant foods that our bodies can't digest. So usually when we eat protein or different other types of carbohydrate or fat, it goes through our body, we break it down and digest it, and then we absorb it and we use it however we might need it. So that's not the case with fiber. Essentially, it passes all the way through the gut and ends up in the large bowel. And that is a very good thing. So there are a lot of health benefits of having fiber in our diet. So it's been linked to sort of reducing the risk of heart disease, colon cancer, stroke, type 2 diabetes. So it's good for your cholesterol levels as well. It helps monitor or control your blood sugar levels. So there are a lot of reasons to have fiber in your diet. The current recommendation is 30 grams of fiber a day. I know it's difficult to know what 30 grams looks like, but it's just to get, most people aren't achieving that. So rather than focusing on how do I get 30 grams, it's usually just thinking about, okay, how can I get more fiber in my diet? The one thing I do want to stress is if you're having a lot of bowel symptoms, this might not be for you right now, because it can actually make your tummy symptoms worse. But otherwise for everyone else, then yes, this is something that we can all think about doing. So how do we get more fiber into our diet? So you want to base your meals on high fiber starchy foods. So things like whole grain, pasta, brown rice. I think a lot of people, when I say that to them, kind of pull a face because they don't think they're as tasty. I will say that firstly, it just takes getting used to. If we've been raised on having white bread, white pasta, white rice, then yes, of course, it's going to taste different. But our taste buds will get used to it. And you may find that actually you prefer it. You might find that you're fine with whole grain bread and whole grain rice, but you really can't with pasta. That's fine. That's 2 out of 3. That's still great. And the other thing to remember is they take longer to cook. So if you are preparing a meal and you've got people coming over, just remember that brown rice can take up to about 25 minutes. So that's caught me out a few times, which can be a bit of a pain. So it's just about preparing and make sure that you're used to that. Then you've got your high fiber snacks. So things like nuts, fruit, seeds, veg sticks with a bit of hummus, they're all brilliant to get your fiber in. And then aim for at least your 5 a day. So fruit and veg have got lots of fiber in them. If you think about the skins of fruit and veg, they're packed with fiber. Potatoes are considered carbohydrate, but if you can, just make sure you're having them with the skins on, because again, there's loads of goodness in that. And I've put here as well, get to know your pulses. So I think this can be a food that's often overlooked, although actually during lockdown, this is the thing on the shelves that had completely sold out. So perhaps people are eating them more now. But things like your chickpeas, your baked beans, your kidney beans, they're so good for you. And what's great is they're cheap. You can store them in the cupboard. You know, they're not going to go off quickly, and they're great to add to stews, to casseroles. And what you can do is you can use them to replace some of the meat. So like I said, you know, it wouldn't hurt anyone who eats meat just to make sure you're not having a lot of it in your diet. So they're great to add, and then you don't have to use as much red meat, which is definitely a healthier option for us. But also just thinking about sort of environmental health, then it's great for us all to be eating more plant-based foods as well. And pulses, like I said, they're really high in fiber, so a great option. What I will say is if you're not having much fiber in your diet, just make sure you do it gradually, because you might notice a few side effects. So don't suddenly go all out and add loads. You just want to be doing it bit by bit. So, you know, gradually increasing your fruit and veg intake, then maybe the following week trying the brown rice and so on, just to make sure that you're doing it gradually. And make sure you're drinking plenty of fluids too. So fiber absorbs fluid in our bowel. So we just want to make sure that we're drinking enough to take that into account. Okay, so I mean, we could probably talk about the gut microbiota for another hour. Don't worry, I won't. But again, so I just wanted to put a slide in here just so that you guys are familiar with it. And again, I know it's a really popular topic on social media at the moment. So essentially the gut is home to millions of bacteria, again, which is a good thing. We also have fungi and viruses in our gut, but usually people tend to talk about the bacteria. And so they're, you know, happily living in our bowel, and they help us out essentially. So it helps produce vitamins and hormones, you know, it helps strengthen the intestine, the immune system. And there's actually evidence now to show that, which sounds really weird, that it actually has the gut microbiota has a positive effect on our mental health as well. So it sort of helps with our mood, which is really interesting, and the research is sort of being done into that at the moment. So what do we want to think about is, the more diverse your gut bacteria, the better. So the bacteria, they all have their own little job. So you want to have lots of different types of bacteria to make sure that you're as healthy as you can be. And everyone's gut bacteria is different. So it's not that we're all the same, but it's actually very individual. But there are a few things that we can all be doing to be making sure that we're looking after our gut bacteria. And that is, again, with the fiber, making sure you're eating a range of sources. So not just sticking to the same fruit and veg all the time. Diversity is really, really important. So thinking about getting lots of different fruit, different vegetables, nuts, seeds, whole grains and pulses in your diet is definitely going to have a beneficial effect. Following a healthy, balanced diet, like we talked about in the beginning. And then also things like exercising regularly is really important. And I don't mean you suddenly have to join a gym or anything like that or start pushing weights. It's really just about moving your body in a way that feels right to you. Some people like going to dance classes, some people like going to the gym, some people like swimming. That's fine. It's whatever you enjoy, because if you enjoy it, you're more likely to do it. And that's the most important thing. Stopping smoking is really important for many reasons, but it does also have an impact on your gut bacteria. And trying to get enough sleep and manage your stress levels as well. Just thinking about supplements, they're not actually necessary. I know that some marketing things would have you believe otherwise, but generally you can get, you know, everything you need from food. And the thing to say is, if you're on treatment, particularly if you're immunosuppressed, then it's best not to take probiotics, because they are essentially a bacteria that get through to your gut. And if you're immunosuppressed, that's not a good idea, because your body might not be able to deal with that bacteria in the way that it normally would. So we wouldn't recommend that you take those supplements during treatment. Okay, so just to summarize, and then we can go through your questions. I'm very aware that I've probably just talked to you and given you a lot of information. So just some take-home messages. Making small, sustainable steps is the best way to do it. I don't believe in dieting. I would never recommend going on a diet, particularly when it promises, you know, you to lose loads of weight, or it's going to change your life and you suddenly have to start juicing and all this ridiculous stuff. Don't do it, because you're not going to stick with it, and we know that they don't work. So if it's literally bit by bit, you're adding in a bit more fruit, a bit more vegetables, you're trying more whole grains, that's brilliant. You're more likely to stick with that. And even if you don't feel like you're doing much, then over time, it's all going to add up. Don't believe everything you read on social media. There's some crazy stuff out there. So just look at who's writing it, and you just want to make sure it's from a credible source. So look for things like, you know, registered dietitians, registered nutritionists. Anyone can call themselves a nutritionist, by the way. They can just do a course on the internet for 2 weeks, but if they say they're registered, then that's definitely a good sign. So just being careful, because I think a lot of people like to give anecdotal evidence about something that's worked for them, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's right for everyone else. There's no food that you need to avoid unless it's causing you specific symptoms, or if you've got an allergy or an intolerance. Otherwise, you know, getting that balance is really important. Make sure that if you've got any ongoing or new symptoms, that you raise that with your medical team. And if you're struggling with eating, if you've lost lots of weight, if you've gained lots of weight, if you're experiencing those nutrition impact symptoms, then please just ask your team to refer you to a dietitian so that they can give you a more personal approach to how to fix your diet and hopefully overcome some of those symptoms. And that's it. So hopefully we can move on to some of the questions now. Thank you so much for listening.
That's great. Thank you so much, Monica. Can you just unshare your screen? Just
Yes. Yeah.
That's perfect. That's great. That was really, really informative. I've certainly learned a lot there.
Good.
Really, really good. I think, Louise, you've got a question, haven't you?
Yeah, so well, there were a couple of things we were going to ask, but you actually touched quite a lot on the taste changes part. I wanted to ask about body image. So we know that people who go through, treatment in terms of chemotherapy, immunotherapy, surgery, may lose weight, or they may gain weight, or they may stay the same. And I just wondered, from a dietitian's point of view, what sort of input you have into that process, sort of the support and advice that you can give people during, but also afterwards, like when it stops, and how you can help with that, really.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's, a lot of people do experience that, is that their body shape does change. And that's down to the treatment quite often. If you've been on something like steroids, then that can cause weight gain. Or if you've been on really harsh treatment, you've lost your appetite, then you've probably lost quite a bit of weight and muscle as well. I think the main thing, firstly, to say is, when you've been through so much, then it's about being kind to yourself as well, and understanding what you've been through. And it can be so easy to look in the mirror and not like what you see. So it's just about showing yourself some compassion, and not going onto a crazy diet or anything like that, because that's definitely not the way forward. And I think, unfortunately, with social media, it's so easy to compare yourself to what you're seeing, all these what's considered perfect bodies. And so trying to avoid that. And if you're following people that don't make you feel great, then for the time being, or for however long, then I would recommend unfollowing them. That can make a really big difference. But then thinking about your diet is just about making changes to get someone back on track. So if someone has gained a lot of weight, firstly, it takes time to lose weight. There's no quick solution, again, no matter what some diets might promise. So it's just sitting down and thinking about what might work for that person, and making sort of small changes that will gradually lead to weight loss, if that's what the aim is. To be honest, I sometimes don't feel like weight is the best thing to look at. I prefer to look at someone's diet, and just make sure that it's got everything in it that it needs. And I find if you're eating healthily most of the time, if you're exercising regularly, then over time your body will just sort of come to the weight that it's meant to be. But that shouldn't be your main focus. And again, if you've lost weight, it's about, quite often people don't want to come off treatment and just eat lots of unhealthy food. It's not what feels right to them. So they don't want to suddenly, yes, I need to gain weight, but I don't want to just start eating loads of chocolate bars. And that's totally understandable. So it's looking about where you can get those sort of healthier calories from. So, the good sources of fats, we think about avocados and nuts, and using olive oil on your, on your dressings and vegetables and that kind of thing, and just how you can get more calories in, but doing it in a balanced way. So looking at your Eat Well guide and how you can still follow that, but just make it slightly higher calorie and higher protein. So there are lots of things you can do.
Thank you.
Great. I was just going to ask as well, Monica, that you mentioned about taste changes when people are having the chemotherapy, and that generally they do resolve themselves and they get their taste back. Have you ever come across anybody that hasn't?
That's really rare. On the whole, things do tend to go back to normal. But there are a few things. So, how I sort of mentioned the oral thrush, if that's not been treated, then that's something that needs to be looked at. If people are having ongoing mouth problems as well, then it might be worth referring to a dentist, just to have a general checkup and to see what's going on and make sure there's, sort of nothing there that needs to be dealt with. The other thing that people find, it's not so much a taste change, but a taste aversion. So something that you might have had on chemotherapy, so let's say like a chicken sandwich, and then you've been sick straight afterwards, not because of the sandwich, but because of the treatment. But you obviously correlate the two. And so then from then after, you just don't want to have a chicken sandwich. And that's actually, if you don't want it, that's fine. There's not going to be any harm in avoiding that. Or if it doesn't work for you, it may eventually, in months or years to come, you might sort of be able to manage them again. The good thing about having a balanced diet is there's so many different food groups and lots of different foods in that food group. You just pick what you like. you know, and go with that.
I was just going to mention as well that when you were talking about the sore mouth, Andy, one of the viewers here, he was saying that he used ice cubes.
Yeah,
that helped with the sore mouth. So
that's a really good idea.
Yeah.
So anything cold, so ice cubes, you know, putting that on your mouth can help soothe it, but also sucking ice lollies.
Cold milk was very good as well.
Yeah, exactly. And it's nourishing, so that's the good thing, is if you're struggling to get anything else in, then, you know, drinking cold milk or cold smoothies can be a great idea.
Yeah, one of the problems was we had to bring in our own ice cubes. So I had ice cubes in a flask,
Right.
because they couldn't provide them on the ward.
Yeah.
Because they couldn't make their own ice on the ward.
Yeah.
Infection control reasons.
Yeah, I know, and that does vary from trust to trust. So some wards, they don't have ice cubes, whereas others will. So it's always worth asking.
Yeah, but they did have ice lollies.
Okay.
But those that obviously they would be bought in, so
Yeah.
rather than making their own. So
Yeah.
What is the sort of, I suppose, standard approach in terms of dietitian input in hospitals in the UK? Because would it be if someone wanted to be referred, they would be referred, or would there always be a dietitian kind of on hand if, you know, when someone starts their treatment?
Yeah, so it really varies
Yeah.
across the UK, depending on the hospitals.
Okay.
So some hospitals will have, yes, a dietitian attached to the team. So then when someone is having difficulty, they can just refer to that specialist dietitian. Others might be attached to a dietetic clinic, so they can refer, you know, people into that clinic. Or they might just refer to the dietetic department, and then whichever dietitian will pick that referral up. So it does depend on the hospital.
Okay.
And is there a time limit, Monica, on people? So from them finishing their treatment to then they're suffering from the late effects, is there a time limit to them being able to be referred back to a dietitian? Or
There shouldn't be, because if they're still experiencing, you know, symptoms, what might happen is you know, rather than being referred to an oncology dietitian, they might be referred to like a gastro dietitian, if that's deemed more appropriate. But if someone's struggling with nutrition related issues, then, you know, you can be referred to a dietitian. The one thing I did say actually is, you know, when someone starts experiencing these side effects, it might not be related to the diagnosis or to the treatment. You know, sometimes people develop IBS later on, and that doesn't have anything to do with either. But again, it's worth, you know, ruling anything else out, and then you could see a dietitian specifically for those symptoms.
That's interesting. What is the difference between a nutritionist and a dietitian?
That's a good question. So yeah, I know that I quickly threw that in at the end there, but just to so essentially dietitians are the only professionals who can work in the NHS in hospitals, because we've done, you know, our degree, and we're registered dietitians, so we can provide that we sort of have that clinical understanding of the way that nutrition plays a role in different diseases. With nutrition, and dietitian is a protected title, so nobody can call themselves a dietitian unless they've been through that degree. Unfortunately, with nutritionists, and it would be great if this could change, is anyone can call themselves a nutritionist. And, you know, it's not a protected title. So you'll often see, again, on social media, someone referring to themselves as a nutritionist. It doesn't really mean anything. But, you know, there are nutrition degrees, which are obviously brilliant. So people who come out of that are also nutritionists and are very reliable. But they can call themselves registered nutritionists, so they're on a register. So it's good to look out for that. That's essentially the difference.
Okay.
That's really important, actually. I'm glad you pointed that out, because as you were saying, on social media, there's often a lot of nonsense written, particularly around cancer, and, you know, how you should be eating during your treatment, and what causes cancer and whatever. So I think it's really important to point out that it should be a registered nutrition or registered dietitian.
Yes.
Whose advice is he following? Yeah.
Exactly. And in terms of if anybody wanted to get further information, the World Cancer Research Fund has great information on their website.
Okay.
Macmillan has great stuff as well about, you know, symptom control and that kind of thing, and stuff to do with nutrition. And then there's sort of more general advice. So things like the British Dietetic Association have got something called Food Facts, and things like the British Heart Foundation. So there's, you know, there's lots of good information out there if you know where to look for it.
Okay, brilliant. Did anyone have any more questions they wanted to ask Monica, or sort of topics to raise? We can always put questions to Monica afterwards, after the webinar, like usual. We can,
yeah.
So don't worry. Val's happy to do that. That's great. No, that's fine, Val. Thank you. Okay, so Atula, did you want to ask something? I don't know if you put his hand up. No. Okay. No. Fabulous. So yeah, I feel like I've taken in a lot of information there, and actually lots of things that seem obvious, but then you forget quite quickly what you should be doing to keep yourself healthy. So thank you so much. And yeah, all that's left to say really is our 8th webinar will be 2 weeks on Thursday, and it will be on fertility and the sort of preservation techniques that are used in the UK, as well as anecdotal story from a lady called Becky whose fertility was not able to be preserved during osteosarcoma treatment. So sort of a reflection on that, as well as from a fertility specialist doctor as well. So that should be very interesting. But no, Monica, thank you so much. And like we say, any more questions we can put to Monica after the webinar, that's no problem.
Okay.
All right, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you so much.